One of the most requested topics is on the temple in Jerusalem in the last days. It seems it is one of the most quoted prophecies regarding the last days that must be fulfilled prior to the second coming of Jesus Christ. I think people latch on to prophecies like this because many last days prophecies are a bit ambiguous and can't be nailed down, such as wars and rumors of wars or earthquakes in diverse places. We even saw through COVID many people believed that it was the great scourge that would come upon mankind before the second coming, which it wasn't. But the temple in Jerusalem is different in that it is a singular event that would be undeniable when it happens and would be a sure sign we are very close to the second coming. Prophecies regarding the last days temple in Jerusalem are throughout Scripture, but this is a complicated topic for a lot of reasons, so to understand it properly we need to go way back in time. No, further, yes, starting with Abraham. See, Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac happened to top Mount Moriah. Where is Mount Moriah? That is the mountain that Jerusalem is built upon. As we know, Isaac's near sacrifice was a similitude of the future sacrifice of God's only begotten Son in the flesh. Where was Christ crucified? Atop Mount Moriah, in likely the same exact spot. If you read Genesis 22 carefully, you will see that in both verses 2 and 9, God tells Abraham the exact spot to go. Most Christian religions believe that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the spot where Christ was crucified, and that is why there is a church and a shrine built there. It seems to me that this is unlikely to be the actual location, as it is clear from the Bible that Christ was taken outside of Jerusalem's walls, which would have been likely through the northern Damascus Gate, as Roman tradition was to crucify people next to the road near city entrances as a warning to others coming into the city to not cause any trouble. This is an early photo of the Damascus Gate, but it was rebuilt in the 10th century. The original Damascus Gate has since been unearthed and it is here. Incidentally, just outside the Damascus Gate is the rock quarry that was used for the building of the Temple Mount. Many of the individual stones used for the Temple Mount construction are incredibly large. These right here are more than 5 feet tall by 16 to 20 feet long and 8 feet deep. So with that being the size of the stones, you can imagine what the size of the quarry would have had to been at the time to build the foundation as well as to quarry all the other stone for the Temple Mount and associated structures. The remains of the quarry were called Golgotha, or Place of the Skull, as there is a large cliff face there looking like a skull, or at least it did until several years ago when a lightning strike took off the skull's nose. As members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we have seen these pictures before. Golgotha is just a stone's throw away from the garden tomb that most everybody, including us, believe Christ was laid in, which also makes more sense that it would need to be nearby due to the haste that they needed to get Christ off of the cross and into a tomb, and even then was only partially prepared for burial. Now going back, remember that Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek, the king of Salem. Salem meaning peace. Jerusalem is the city of peace where Abraham gave those tithes to Melchizedek, his priesthood leader. Israel is the land that would be given to Abraham as an inheritance by God. If you remember, due to the famine years later when Joseph, Abraham's great-grandson, is now second in command in Egypt and saves his family from starvation, they all moved to Egypt and for a time abandoned their ancestral lands in Israel. 430 years go by, and Moses now frees the Israelites that have been enslaved by the Egyptians. The Exodus happens, and they build a tabernacle. They use the portable tabernacle until they get their ancestral lands back after their 40 years of wandering in the desert. A few centuries later, King Solomon builds the first temple in Jerusalem on what is now known as the Temple Mount. This temple is destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC, just after Lehi and his family head to the Promised Land, as foretold. When some of the Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem about 70 years later after the Babylonian conquest, they began building the temple again, around 516 BC, on the same location as the first temple. This in later years came to be known as Herod's Temple, or the Second Temple, which is the temple that existed in Jerusalem during the time of Christ's mortal ministry. This temple, as prophesied, was destroyed as part of the siege on Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD by Titus, for which the Arch of Titus still stands in Rome, with the looting of the temple carved right on it. The temple prophesied to be built prior to Christ's second coming is commonly referred to as the Third Temple. Sorry for this bit of a history lesson, but it becomes important as we understand the future of the Temple Mount and the building of the Third Temple. After the Romans razed the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD, Jews were not permitted back until Emperor Constantine rebuilt Jerusalem as a Christian center of worship, including the building of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 335, which, as I mentioned prior, is the traditional site of the crucifixion, although I don't believe that's the exact spot. However, the Temple Mount was intentionally left desolate as a sign of the fulfillment of Christ's prophecy that not one stone of the temple would be left standing. And so it remained for 3 centuries, visited by pilgrims following in Jesus Christ's footsteps, but unadorned by any Christian shrine. Thus, when Arab Muslims conquered Jerusalem in 638 under Caliph Umar, they entered into the treaty to protect the Christian and Jewish holy places in the city. Searching for a location in Jerusalem to construct a mosque for the new Muslim community, the Arabs naturally turned to the large space left empty by the Christians on the old Temple Mount. Soon the Arabs had built not only the Al-Aqsa Mosque for prayer and worship, but also a new shrine. Known as the Dome of the Rock, the sanctuary is one of the great architectural achievements of the Islamic world. It commemorated the biblical Temple of Solomon and the place where Jesus taught and performed miracles, both of which were described in the Quran and accepted by Muslims as authentic sacred history. In addition, Muslims believed that Muhammad had visited the Temple Mount of Jerusalem in vision, ascending from there into heaven. This location is considered by Muslims to be one of the holiest sites on earth, second only to Mecca. This is important because we now have 3 of the largest worldwide religions, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, that hold the exact same spot as among the most sacred to their religions. Can you begin to see why there's been so much conflict over the centuries over this spot of ground? This chart shows who controlled Jerusalem throughout the time, being color-coded by non-Arabic nations, Jewish nations, Christian nations, Muslim nations, and even when there was a division. We can't possibly go through all of this, but some of the most well-known by us today is the Crusades, which began in 1099 AD. In short, the Crusaders were European Christians that wanted to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims and Jewish inhabitants, which they did for a time, through a massive loss of life. It is during this period that the Knights Templar had its beginnings. Jerusalem remained under Christian control until 1187, when it again fell to Muslim rule. Now, for you history buffs out there, I am doing a great injustice skimming over all of this for a spot of ground on the earth that has likely seen more war and conflict, politics and destruction than perhaps any other spot. And to skim over history like this leaves a lot of gaps and much to be desired. But please remember, we are trying to understand just enough to get to the Third Temple period in the last days. In 1841, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints sent an apostle, Elder Orson Pratt, to the Holy Land to dedicate the land for the return of the Jewish people. Part of this dedicatory prayer is as follows: I dedicate and consecrate this land unto thee for the gathering together of Judah's scattered remnants, according to the predictions of the holy prophets. Incline them to gather in upon the land according to thy word. Let them come like clouds and like doves to their windows. Let the large ships of the nations bring them from the distant isles, and let kings become their nursing fathers, and queens their motherly fondness wipe the tears of sorrow from their eyes. When Elder Hyde offered that dedicatory prayer, there were fewer than 5,000 Jewish people in the entire land of Palestine. Today there are over 7 million, and they have literally come from the 4 corners of the earth, from over 100 separate nations, and this is in fulfillment of that prophecy. During the Holocaust of World War II, Jews fled Europe and many went to Israel. International support was garnered to give the Jews their own state. So as a result of World War II, Israel was divided up into areas for the Palestinians, or Muslims, in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and for the Israelites, or the Jews, across the rest of Israel. But Jerusalem, being such a contested area, was designated as an international zone. If you really wanted to understand the politics and dynamics around the more recent history of Israel, there's a link to a 5-minute video on the subject that I thought was pretty good that was made by somebody else. But keep in mind, this is all only scraping the surface. So within the walls of Jerusalem, ethnic centers for Jews, Muslim, and several Christian religions have been established over the centuries. To this day in Jerusalem, if you visit, you can walk through the Jewish quarter, the Christian quarter, Armenian quarter, and the Muslim quarter. These areas are designated for the different ethnicities attempting to live together in the city. In some areas, you have to pass through security checkpoints with military guard to go into different areas of the city or specific sites. For decades, these Third Temple movements have been preparing and agitating for the rebuilding of the temple, going so far as to make utensils, furnishings, and priestly robes for the use in the coming sanctuary. Every year on Jewish holy days, these groups have attempted to force their way onto the Temple Mount to pray, which is a violation, and have consequently been turned away. In recent years, however, increasing numbers of Jews have begun wider agitation for the right to ascend the Temple Mount to pray, in violation of the early 1967 status quo agreement regarding the site. Palestinian Muslims have reacted with both demonstrations and violence, and with the threat of a potentially new intifada, or an uprising. Thus, despite Isaiah's prophecy that the Temple Mount should be a house of prayer for all nations, it remains a source of discord and conflict. The Temple Mount itself can be visited by anyone as long as the rules are followed, but visitors are not allowed in the Dome of the Rock itself, as it is considered a special holy site for Muslims, much like we don't allow visitors into our temples. However, the Jews believe that one day they will build a third temple on the Temple Mount. We also believe that this will happen prior to the second coming of the Lord. But as you can imagine, it isn't like they can just go up there and start building a temple. Tension is so high in this region, and everyone is so religiously and politically sensitive that large-scale conflict can easily break out over any moves. There are some members of our church that believe that we will build a temple in Jerusalem, or that we could convert the BYU Jerusalem Center into a temple. That is just not the case, and it matters for two reasons. First, the Jews will build the temple. Wilford Woodruff once said, quote, "Christ will not come until the Jews have returned to their own lands and have rebuilt the city of Jerusalem and the temple there." Second, some believe that the Jews or we could build a temple and it could be anywhere in Jerusalem. That isn't the case either. The temple in Jerusalem would be built on the Temple Mount in the same location as the first and second temples. Orson Pratt once said, quote, "Then when the Gentile nations shall reject this gospel and count themselves unworthy of eternal life, as the Jews did before them, the Lord will say, 'It is enough, come away from them, my servants. I will give you a new commission. You shall go to the scattered remnants of the house of Israel. I will gather them in from the four quarters of the earth and bring them again into their own land. They shall build Jerusalem on its own heap. They shall rear a temple on the appointed place in Palestine, and they shall be grafted in again." Now this leads to something interesting. King Solomon's temple was a very large temple complex covering nearly all of the Temple Mount. King Herod's temple was a much smaller complex. If you look at the aerial view of the Temple Mount, the Dome on the Rock is built on the south side, leaving a large open area on the north side. It is not a small area. If you can see the small structure, it is called the Dome of the Spirits. The Dome of the Spirits is where you can see the threshing floor, in other words, the actual bedrock of the Temple Mount. But more importantly, it is the location of where the Ark of the Covenant was housed within the Holy of Holies in the ancient temple. If you were to walk directly east from the Dome of the Spirits towards the Mount of Olives, you would walk through the Lion's Gate. The Lion's Gate is one of the 8 gates into Jerusalem. It is on the east side facing the Garden of Gethsemane. Notice how the Lion's Gate is off-center from the Dome of the Rock. Both tradition and a lot of recently discovered archaeological evidence suggest that it was a straight line from the Lion's Gate into the temple court. The temple was a straight temple, meaning that if you kept walking straight west, you would walk into the courtyard, into the tabernacle, and into the Holy of Holies. So from this standpoint, a temple could be built on this location without having to destroy the Dome of the Rock, which many people suppose must happen. This model shows the entire Temple Mount with both the position of the Dome of the Rock as well as the Lion's Gate. I don't know if it will happen that way or not, but I can more easily imagine a scenario where the temple is allowed to be built just north of the Dome of the Rock rather than the destruction of the Dome of the Rock. But with how things are today, either would likely lead to a huge war. So I'm not saying it will happen this way, I'm just saying there is space for it. Others have disagreed. For example, Charles W. Penrose, in the Journal of Discourses, stated, quote, "The work is moving on for the gathering of the Jews to their own lands, that they may build it up as it was in former times, that the temple may be rebuilt, and the mosque of the Muslim, which now stands in its place, may be moved out of the way, that Jerusalem may be built upon its original site." But he even says it may be moved out of the way. But the temple, no matter what it looks like, will be built here. So when you hear rumors that there is a group of Jews that are already building a temple in Jerusalem, that is not the case. There is a group that has been planning it for many years, but only a temple built on the Temple Mount will count as the one that must exist prior to the second coming. So the temple will be in the location as it has always been. But there are some in our church that think that we could just throw up a temple in Jerusalem in no time and don't think it really matters if it's on the Temple Mount or not. Right now, we're not even currently allowed to proselyte in Israel. There is an agreement between our church and the Israeli government that prohibits us from performing any activities, including encouraging or leading people in Israel to investigate any religion for possible conversion. It also says that we will not, quote, distribute either directly or by mail or by internet any materials pertaining to the church or its doctrines within Israel or Palestine. You can read it, but there are many other things that we're currently prohibited from doing. With that, let's talk about the second coming, because as I've said in many other videos, there's a lot of confusion within the church regarding this, and it makes all the difference in the world when it comes to the third temple in Jerusalem. There are several events that many in the church call the second coming, and people reading about these events in Scripture and even talks by general authorities often get them confused with each other. There are in fact 4 appearances of the Lord which often get confused. 1, Christ's appearance at Adam-ondi-Ahman. 2, Christ's appearance at the temple in the New Jerusalem in Jackson County, Missouri. 3, when Christ touches down on the Mount of Olives and saves the Jews in Jerusalem from annihilation. And 4, when Christ comes in glory wearing red apparel, lifts the righteous, and burns the wicked, ushering in the millennium. In a talk by Ezra Taft Benson, he mentions 3 of these, leaving out the appearance at Adam-ondi-Ahman. Perhaps that's because he was not really considering that part of the second coming, but rather a precursor. Or perhaps it is associated with the appearances in the temple in Zion, which could be very near the same time. But he talks about these 3 appearances which need to be understood where and when they happen to understand the prophecy about the third temple. He says, quote, "One appearance will be to the righteous saints who have gathered to the New Jerusalem here in America. In this place of refuge they will be safe from the wrath of the Lord, which will be poured out without measure on all nations. Another appearance of the Lord will be to the Jews, to these beleaguered sons of Judah, surrounded by hostile Gentile armies, who again threaten to overrun Jerusalem. The Savior, their Messiah, will set his feet upon the Mount of Olives. Yet another appearance of Christ will be to the rest of the world. Here is the description of his coming. The Lord shall be red in his apparel, and his garments like him that treadeth the wine vat." So after the persecution of the saints, a righteous remnant will go to Missouri, begin to build Zion as well as the temple there. Christ will appear there first, but this is not his coming in glory. Then during or after this time, Armageddon will happen around Jerusalem with the largest army ever amassed. President Woodruff has also discussed this subject, saying, quote, "O house of Judah, it is true that after your return and gather your nation home and rebuild your city and temple, that the Gentiles will gather together their armies to go against you to battle, to take you a prey and to take you as a spoil, which they will do, for the words of your prophets must be fulfilled." The siege will happen on Jerusalem, and the 2 witnesses will protect Jerusalem for 3.5 years until they are killed. Then, after the 3.5 days, the 2 witnesses will be resurrected. Then the Lord himself will come down and touch down on the Mount of Olives, and it will split in 2, causing the greatest earthquake the world has ever known, saving the Jews from the hostile army. This event converts the Jews to believe in Christ, but this is not Christ coming in glory. By the way, I've done a bunch of videos on each of these topics, and the easiest way to find them, as well as thousands of other topic videos, is by using the free Gospel Learning app, which is available on iPhone and Android. Search on topics such as the Second Coming, Armageddon, 2 Witnesses, Returning to Missouri, Signs of the Times, and thousands of other topics. On the app, there are videos from BYU speeches, general conference addresses, Book of Mormon Central, and many other great sources, all indexed by topic, including hard-to-find topics or sensitive topics. We wanted the app to be a safe, trusted source for gospel learning. But after Christ saves the Jews, we enter into the half hour of silence. No one is certain how long this will be, but this is when the Jews will rebuild Jerusalem again and they will build a temple. Now, you probably just heard the Wilford Woodruff quote that says that would happen before, and maybe that's going to happen. We talk about that in a minute. But either way, it would likely have to be rebuilt after that destruction if it was damaged or destroyed. This is the third temple, or perhaps the fourth, which will be an authorized temple for the performance of ordinances like every other temple in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Then, after the half hour of silence, the Lord comes in glory, wearing his red apparel. He lifts up the righteous. He calls forth from the grave those that are part of the morning of the first resurrection. He burns the wicked and ushers in the millennium. So that is how I believe the sequence of events will go. And as always, you don't have to believe me. Do your own study and come to your own conclusions. But there are still those that try to combine Christ's coming in glory with him saving the Jews from the annihilation of Armageddon as one event. For me, it is impossible to reconcile the rest of the signs of the times, as Scripture makes it clear that some of the signs happen after the Christ saves the Jews and before the second coming, including building of this temple. This continues to confuse many. If you're one that continues to be confused, reread those sections on the signs of the times with the idea that saving the Jews and Christ's return in glory are two separate events. If you do this, you will find that things surrounding the second coming, last days, and the signs of the times are much easier to understand. When I realized this, it was a huge turning point in my gospel understanding. In fact, I think the prophecy about the third temple really confirms that the time Christ saves the Jews is not his coming in glory. The reason is pretty simple. We know that when he saves the Jews, that is when the prophecy in Zechariah 13:6 happens, which says, "And one shall say unto him, What are these wounds in thine hands? Then he shall answer, Those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends." We know this is when the Jews are converted. Then the Jews can build an authorized temple for ordinances, which has to be completed before Christ's second coming in glory. Joseph Fielding Smith once said, quote, "After the Jews have repented and received the gospel, having acknowledged Jesus Christ as their Redeemer, the temple in Jerusalem will be built according to the prophecy in Ezekiel." Bruce R. McConkie once said, "When the Jews receive the fullness of the everlasting gospel, they will return to Jerusalem as the Lord's true legal administrators, to build up Jerusalem as a Zion and to place again on the ancient site the temple of the new kingdom." He also said, quote, "The temple in Jerusalem will not be built by Jews who have assembled there for political purposes as at present, but it will be built by Jews who have come unto Christ, who once again are in the true fold of their ancient shepherd, and who have learned anew about temples because they know that Elijah did come." There are also those that believe the temple will be built before Christ saves the Jews from Armageddon, as I said before. For me, that seems unlikely for the conflict it would cause, but it isn't impossible. That may be why latter-day animal sacrifices are discussed in the Old Testament. But if they do, that will not be an authorized temple to perform ordinances, as the Jews will not be yet converted. If there is a temple already built before Christ saves the Jews, it would have to be retrofitted to be used for ordinances like the ones we do in our temples today. If a temple is built prior, it is possible that it could be destroyed by the invading army and needs to be rebuilt a fourth time. Currently, the plans for the temple by the Jews is based on all of the Mosaic laws of sacrifice, but we know the Jerusalem temple will have the same saving ordinances performed there as every other temple. Joseph Smith said, "What was the object of gathering the Jews or the people of God in any age of the world? The main object was to build unto the Lord a house whereby he could reveal unto his people the ordinances of his house and the glories of his kingdom, and teach the people the way of salvation. For there are certain ordinances and principles that, when they are taught and practiced, must be done in a place or house built for that purpose." Doctrine and Covenants 124 makes it even more clear, which says, quote, "For it is ordained that in Zion and in her stakes and in Jerusalem, those places that I have appointed for refuge shall be the places for your baptisms for your dead. And again, verily I say unto you, how shall your washings be acceptable unto me, except ye perform them in a house which you have built to my name? I've also been told that we, as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aren't allowed to build a temple in Jerusalem, but I couldn't find any evidence of that. But again, this would go against all the prophecies of the third temple being built on the Temple Mount. Not to mention, currently there are a total of 4 branches in the church in all of Israel, with a total church membership of 313 people as of this recording. Plus, it is prophesied that the Jews will build this temple, not us. So we need the converted Jews to take this responsibility, which will only happen after Christ saves the Jews at Armageddon, and then they will build an authorized temple before the Lord comes in glory. Another bit of evidence in my mind about the timing is the prophecy that a fountain will open from under the Jerusalem temple and will flow down and heal the Red Sea. This is prophesied in Ezekiel 47 verses 1 through 10. It basically says that a spring of water will issue forth from under the temple, right under the altar in fact, and flow out from the temple, down east and flow into the Dead Sea and heal it. It would seem that the great earthquake that happens when Christ touches the Mount of Olives reroutes some underground water sources. As it relates to the order of events, Joseph Smith listed it this way. He said, Judah must return, Jerusalem must be rebuilt, and the temple, and the water come out from under the temple, and the waters of the Dead Sea be healed. It will take some time to rebuild the walls of the city and the temple, etc. And all of this must be done before the Son of Man will make his appearance. Again, illustrating that this is after Christ saves the Jews and they become converted, but before Christ comes in glory. What will the Jerusalem temple be like? Well, it is described in depth in Ezekiel 40 through 48, but beyond that, in a May 1972 Ensign article entitled The Future of the Holy Land, it says this concerning the building of the third temple. An important scroll was discovered in the Middle East just a few years ago. Dr. Yigal Yadin of the Hebrew University is now translating this scroll, which he calls the Temple Scroll, and concerning which he has said, quote, the amazing thing about this scroll is that it was written as a Torah, a law given by God to Moses. The entire text is written in the first person singular, with God as the speaker. Every other scroll from the Dead Sea is either a copy of an existent biblical book or a biblical commentary or a sectarian document composed by the Qumran community. Here we have for the first time a scroll that was apparently meant to be in the biblical text, but which was never part of the biblical canon, so far as we know. With what does this text deal? Dr. Yadin says that it has the plans for the construction of a great temple, and that it introduces a new feature in the temple. There are 3 courts instead of 2, each exactly square. The middle and the outer courts of the temple are to have 12 gates, 3 on each side, and each gate is to be named for one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Dr. Yadin adds, quote, this is significant. The whole apocalyptic literature and that of Qumran were occupied with the concept of uniting the 12 tribes of Israel as ordained by God. Here, too, the emphasis is on the 12 tribes, as it is so frequently also in the New Testament. I think it is interesting that this will be precisely at the time the 10 tribes return. It is also interesting that the temple complex in Missouri has had plans for 12 separate tribes. One unique thing about the Jerusalem temple is that it will be the only temple that has a throne for Jesus Christ to sit on. This is prophesied both in Ezekiel and in modern day. You may have also heard about the red heifer associated with the temple in Jerusalem. The belief is that the temple service cannot begin without the Paran Adumah, the red heifer. Jews believe that the rites as described in Numbers 19 must be performed to cleanse the temple once it has been built. It includes sacrificing a perfect red heifer and using the blood and ashes as a purification ritual for the Temple Mount and all the things therein. The rabbis consider the red heifer one of the greatest mysteries of the Torah. Even they wonder how it's possible that the ashes of the sacrificial animal can purify from sin and defilement. We as members of the church and believers in Christ can see the symbolism between a perfect red animal and Jesus Christ who does purify us. But the commandments regarding the red heifer is such a mystery to them that the rabbis place it in the category of chukim. divine decrees that cannot be understood by our limited human understanding. Kosher and dietary laws also fit into this category. In order for a cow to qualify as a red heifer for this holy purpose of purification, it must meet the following requirements as outlined in Numbers 19, and also in the writings of the oral tradition of the Talmud. 1. The red heifer must be absolutely perfect in its redness. Even 2 hairs of any other color would disqualify it. Even its hooves must be red. 2. It was to be 3 or 4 years old. Although older animals could be used, younger animals could not. 3. It must be free of any kind of internal or external defect or blemish. And 4. It must not have ever been used in any type of physical labor and never have been placed under a yoke, not even once. Only an animal that meets all of these requirements may be used to provide the ashes for the purification process in fulfillment of the commandment. According to Jewish tradition, only 9 red heifers have been offered since the time of Moses. This would make them very rare indeed, although no one knows if that means 9 were used or that only 9 ever existed. Needless to say, people seem to get excited when a red heifer is born, in the hopes that it meets all the qualifications, as this seems to indicate to people that the second coming is very near, although I think that this can be misleading for several reasons. A few of these red heifers have been born over the past few decades, but each time they've been disqualified for one reason or another. The belief is that the 10th red heifer will be used for the purification ritual of the Jerusalem temple. Now that is the Jewish belief. Maybe the temple will be built before Christ saves the Jews, and they will perform this Mosaic law ritual before they are converted to Christianity. Perhaps the temple will be built after Christ saves the Jews, and they will go through this ritual, although it seems to me that when they learn that Christ was the great and last sacrifice, that they will not perform this animal sacrifice. Perhaps, as they are converted to Christianity, they will realize that ritualistic sacrifice performed in biblical times no longer applies today. Or perhaps there's something to it that I simply don't understand. It wouldn't be the first time for that. But the red heifer being pure and perfect surely represents Christ. Those biblical animal sacrifices were meant to be a similitude of the atonement of Christ. So I don't know if the red heifer sacrifice and purification ritual will happen or not, but it seems somewhat inconsequential to me. That being said, I found it interesting that in the chapel of the Draper, Utah temple, there is a large painting that includes the red heifer in the bottom left-hand corner. I hope this helps demystify some of the history, prophecies, and future of the temple in Jerusalem and how it all relates to the second coming of Jesus Christ. Thanks for watching.